See that? Alright, so for tonight's assignment, I'm recording at the Green in Morristown, and which was referenced to in chapter 20 of tonight's reading. Here's where Washington was encamped in 1777, and later where he met with Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton about where French ships were coming to help the American cause. Alright, look, I'm here hanging with George Washington and Lafayette and Hamilton. That's cool. Alright, so let me get started. So instead of stick figures this week, you're going to have to just look at me read from reference this book here. So tonight's question asks, why did the British lose and why did the Americans win? After previous readings, it seemed like the British had the upper hand, yet we all know that they lost. So why is that? Well, like any war, there are countless reasons, but for today's assignment, I'm going to focus on two. That being the involvement of the French, like they're discussing here, and also the American spirit, which we have focused on many times before. So first, the French involvement. In chapter 16, Ramsay points out that it was not only a help to the Americans for the French to become involved, but it would help France, not so much for the Americans to win, but more for the British to lose. He states that the dismemberment of the British Empire with France has an interest in accomplishing. He later refers to some British ignorance, thinking that France would not get involved, and perhaps that only strengthened why France did. He later goes on to suggest that once the Americans and French were allies, they could not desert each other for how that would reflect on British appearances. The British were in turn fueled by this alliance, for as Ramsay describes as interfering in what they would call the domestic quarrel. Regardless, the French knew that a British loss would help tip the balance of power in their favor, and the Americans were eager to accept any help they could receive at this point. Okay, before I get to my second point, I'm going to show you this church right there. And there's this sign here, and it states that this is where, if you see, it became a hospital for troops in 1777 and 1778. So secondly, while the British may have had the history on their side, the Americans were fighting with ideology and spirits on theirs. Even after having vessels sunk and houses burned, it seemed to fuel the American spirit. In chapter 17, Ramsay describes that it would presume that by involving the citizens in loss and distress, they would be brought to reflect on the advantages of submitting to a power. But that did not happen because he writes that compared to the American state of mind, property had comparatively less value, and it was fashionable to suffer in the cause of independence. To continue, he writes that the more extensively they carried on the mode of warfare, the more obstacles they created to the reunion of the empire. He goes on to describe how this change of mind happened gradually over time. And he refers to that when the elder citizens grow up with love and attachment to the British, but now after what they suffered, associating themselves as British caused them distress, and they will not want to do that again. Even more so, in chapter 18, Ramsay describes the distress that southern colonies were under. Even when facing surrender or defeat, Ramsay states that the greatest part of them retained an affection for their American brethren, and shuddered at the thought of taking arms against them. This further implicates that the British tactics, further described in chapter 18, as trying to secure the general submission of the whole body of the people, had not only failed, but it further fueled the American resolve to win with what Ramsay describes as vigor and spirit. So, on 33 windy day, goodbye from Morristown, New Jersey.